The charming town of York boasts a lot of Viking heritage. It became very visible during the Coppergate excavation between 1976 and 1981. So in this video, we're going to travel back in time to see what life was really about in Viking Age York. Previously known as Eoforwich in Anglo-Saxon times and as Eboracum in Roman times, was the royal centre of the Kingdom of Northumbria. It was also the seat of an archbishop and also a very important trading spot. The Vikings capture York in 866 on All Saints' Day, which may or may not have been a coincidence, and this is linked to the arrival of the Great Heathen Army. The characters involved in these events are of course the famous sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar Lothbrok might have not existed at all. He might have been a composite character made up of several historical characters, but his sons are definitely mentioned: Halfdan, Uber and Ivar the Boneless. They basically exploited a deep-seated conflict between two kings, Osberth and Ela, and ultimately both of them were defeated. There was a counterattack in 867, but both kings were killed, and that is where we also have the legend of King Ella being killed in that very gruesome way by having the eagle carved on him. Now, there has been some debate about the realism of such a torture method. It would have definitely been possible, but I think it was rather an overinterpretation of a poetic metaphor. A decisive event happens in 878 when Halfdan decides to hand the land of the Northumbrians to the Scandinavians, so they basically become landowners in the newly conquered lands. The half kingdom of Deira, so that would be southern Northumbria, was over, and what the Vikings tried to do is to install puppet kings such as Ecgbert. Furthermore, Jorvik was dynastically intertwined with the Vikings of Dublin, but the winter camp might have been at Old Walk, which is a place located 20 kilometers northwest of York. The 10th century marks the development of York as a truly urban centre. We have evidence for both manufacturing and a lot of commerce, and the city would have had about 10,000 inhabitants. The archaeological site is called Coppergate. Timber buildings with plank-lined cellars were found here, as well as two specialized areas for metallurgy, glassmaking, textiles, antlerworking, and a lot more. From the north and the Viking Scandinavian homelands came goods like whalebone, walrus ivory, amber, and steatite or soapstone. In fact, one of the very few fragments of military equipment found at Coppergate was a 5-lobed sword pommel made of whalebone. Walrus ivory is represented in goods such as the gaming pieces for a board game and a large gaming die. And ivory was favored in the Viking world as a material for producing gaming pieces. At Clifford Street, beads, rings, and pendants were collected, and another site of amber working was identified at Coppergate when some sort of item was excavated along with small waste flakes. Very interesting are the personal items in a range of materials that were uncovered in Coppergate. There were luxury items in precious metals, but also imitation wares in cheaper materials like copper alloy or pewter, so that the less wealthy could also imitate the appearance of richer members of society. And this is exemplified in the disc brooches. The larger examples are in pewter. Another type of copper alloy cloak fastener is the ringed pin, several of which were recovered at Coppergate, and this type originates in 10th century Ireland, which is an indication of the trading and political links between Dublin and York. We also have belt fittings such as buckles and strap ends, and they can incorporate animal heads and interlace patterns similar to those seen in monumental sculptures. And also found at Coppergate were examples of prick spurs attached to the wearer's feet, and they were functional, but at the same time they could also be a fashion statement or status symbol. The remains of a glass recycling furnace were found at Coppergate, along with evidence for the manufacture of glass beads. Almost 300 glass beads were found, and the overwhelming majority are just one color, most often blue, green, or yellow. We also have two unusual orange beads given a gold foil covering, and two others in a colorless glass with an internal gold colored layer. And personal adornment did not end with jewelry. The residents also had leather goods decorated with complex patterns too, such as the sheaths for the long knives known as the seax. These were made of calf leather, folded into shape and decorated on the outer face with interlace and cross-hatched lines. Other items that were worn at the waist were the hone stones. Some of them are made of schist, likely sourced in central southern Norway. And we also have iron keys of various shapes and sizes found at Coppergate, keys for fixed locks, and two types of padlock, box and barrel, found here, suggesting that security was important, but the key was also an expression of wealth and status. A number of finds suggest that the Vikings were at pains to keep themselves well groomed. 3 pairs of copper alloyed tweezers were excavated, and one of these is decorated with a white glass bead. And sometimes the tweezers are found in combination with other items, such as ear scoops or toothpicks. So indeed, they tried to keep themselves clean. Over 130 bone pins were found in the Viking levels at Coppergate, and one of them even has a very elaborate dragonesque head. They may have been used as dress fastenings usually, but it is also conceivable that some were worn in the hair. And then again, we have a lot of combs made of bone and antler, and they exhibit considerable workmanship, requiring the use of specialized tools, and their lavish decoration highlights their usage as status items. Many of these featured ring and dot designs. Antler was the preferred material for comb making, and in York this was obtained for the most part from red deer stags. The Viking layers at Coppergate show that we are dealing with a densely occupied urban landscape whose inhabitants produced very large amounts of rubbish. For example, discarded animal bones, waste food, and other refuse, only some of which was buried in pits. The rise in the ground level during the early medieval period suggests that there were no systems in place for the removal of this rubbish, and it accumulated. So yeah, it was a pretty disgusting environment. Adding to that was the pollution coming from industrial processes such as metal and leatherworking. And one very important piece of evidence to show this urban environment and its challenges is the so-called Lloyd's Bank coprolite, the largest complete example of preserved human excrement ever found. I talked about this elsewhere, but in a nutshell, the analysis of the coprolite showed that the individual who produced it was infested with whipworms and more worms, likely to have caused him itching and, a lot of discomfort. Another hazard to human health came in the form of the corn cockle. The seeds are poisonous and difficult to remove from harvested grain prior to milling, and seed fragments in the flour would have probably caused stomach complaints. Viking era society, especially in such a thriving trading center like York, would have encompassed great variety. Of course, the great army that captured York in 866 originated in Scandinavia. The bulk of the members probably came from Denmark and Norway, but modern labels of identity like Danish or Norwegian are completely meaningless in this context. They're very modern terms. Furthermore, the analysis of human remains from Viking era York has added more complexity to the picture. Isotopic analysis was carried out on the tooth enamel samples from 3 of the 4 burials found in the Coppergate dig, and also analysis of strontium isotope ratios. So these two methods suggested a possible origin in Yorkshire, although not York itself, for 2 of the individuals, one male and the other female. But the third, a female, produced results consistent with a childhood spent in southwest Norway. People traveled willingly to the city from across the Viking world to trade, to find employment or better settlement, but we always have to remember that slavery was a feature of the Viking era. It was absolutely massive. The Vikings were often indiscriminate in who they took as slaves, so individuals might be transported over very large distances away from their regions of origin. There isn't really much evidence for the lives and identities of the unfree, but there are several contemporary accounts of slave taking by Vikings in Ireland. So we do have a mix of people arriving in York, and this would have given rise to a culturally diverse population. So you should imagine hearing a lot of languages on the streets: Old Norse, Old English, Old Frisian, as well as Old Irish and Welsh, and of course Latin, the language of the church. Although York already had stone buildings in the shape of Roman fortifications and early stone churches, the Vikings who first arrived in the city chose to build with wood. Soon after 900, Coppergate was divided into long, narrow properties. Single-story, one-room houses were built at regular intervals, and they were roughly 4 meters wide and 8 meters or more in length. And they had walls of waterwork smeared with daub, the clay-based mixture that hardened when dry. Tree ring dating suggests that the buildings went out of use abruptly between 955 and 960, which would coincide with the expulsion of the Viking king Eric Bloodaxe. After 960, there was a renewed burst of building activity. Houses in the new style were planked or one or two-storied structures made of oak, and they had dugout floors with planks to line the sides of the pit. Thatch was still used for roofs, although at least one building might have used turf and heather. Although the wooden structures are not durable, at least in comparison with the stone ones, the Viking-era buildings did leave a lasting mark on the urban landscape, because the plots seen in Coppergate were repeated elsewhere along the city's Viking-era streets, and the efforts at town planning were not just abated during the Viking Age, but the buildings erected along York streets in subsequent centuries, many of which stand today, they do obey the Vikings' plot divisions. Evidence for cooking comes in the form of wooden spoons and a spatula among the cooking utensils excavated at Coppergate, as well as an iron pan resembling the ones still used in kitchens today. The most common pottery vessels are represented in cooking pots, and the outer surfaces are often coated in soot, suggesting that they stood heating their contents at the edge of smoky hearths. There has also been analysis of the organic chemicals on pottery, and the recovered substances are usually lipids, the fats, waxes, and oils found in a wide range of foodstuff. And this time, they predominantly derive from animal fats like beef, lamb, and pork. And also present are the typical lipids of leaf wax, with a pattern that closely matches the cabbage family. So they would consume some vegetables as well. Large pitcher-type vessels were also used at Coppergate, and they were tipped instead of being lifted, and pour the contents through a short spout. Some of this pottery was produced at kilns in Torksey, in Nottinghamshire, and this kind of vessel was favoured throughout the Danelaw. In the 4 tons of animal bones excavated, cattle were the most commonly represented, followed by pigs and then sheep. And the distribution of butchered bones across the excavation suggests that slaughter was carried out at a domestic or neighborhood level, so there was not really a dedicated quarter. Analysis of soil has provided evidence in the form of seeds for various food plants: crabapples, hips, haws, rowan berries, and so on. The remains of a butter churn dash suggest that dairy products also featured in the diet of York's Vikings. Another important industry yielding evidence is the textile industry. Every part of the textile production process was carried out by women at home in Coppergate, like elsewhere in the Viking world. And we do have evidence in the form of sheep lice found in the domestic floor levels, showing that raw wool was carried into the houses to be prepared. Now, we don't really have parts of a warp-weighted loom found here, but we do have weights and other tools associated with loom use. And we also have evidence for the colors that were used. The dye plants like woad yielding blue, or weld for yellow, and green weed for yellow or green, and a deep pile of dark red vegetable matter identified as madder. And we also have slick stones for smoothing linen found at the Viking layer as well, and also smoothing boards that might have been used in combination with them. Now, one of the most celebrated finds is a sock, and this sock was produced using a Scandinavian technique known as nålebinding, a process of single needle knitting suitable for making stuff like mittens, hats, and bags. And this sock is very important because it is the only example of historical nålebinding known in England. Together with the evidence for craft and industry, we also have glimpses of the pastime in York. Gaming pieces in bone, antler, jet, or ivory, as well as part of a gaming board. The plank is one of the 5 that would have been joined together to make the board, whose squares were scratched into the surface of the wood. 3 rows of 15 cells are marked, and it might have been used to play knevertavel. Unfortunately, we are not sure about the rules of this game. A more familiar game played both in the Viking Age and in the later medieval period was Nine Men's Morris, and in fact a wooden plank with a Nine Men's Morris board carved into the upper surface was found over the Viking era grave of a child. 42 objects interpreted as ice skates were also found. The majority were made from horse metatarsals and metacarpals, cut flat and polished on one side, trimmed at one end and drilled with a hole at the other. A leather thong held in place by a wooden peg was inserted into the hole to attach the skate to the wearer's ankle. 90 pig trotter bones were also found, each having a hole cut through the middle, and one interpretation has them as buzz bones. They would have been inexpensive toys that would have produced a buzzing noise generated by passing a cord through the hole and stretching and twisting it. But a more celebrated object is definitely the music instrument known as the boxwood panpipes, found in a 10th century pit, the only known example of such an instrument. Although damaged, it can be seen that there were originally at least 5 tubes accurately bored into the wood, and when blown, these ancient pipes still produce a scale from top A to top E. The Coppergate excavation produced evidence from every stage of the metalworking process, from the ore that provided the raw material for smelting to metal separating trays, crucibles and molds, metal sheets, rods and wires, and finished articles as well, such as horseshoes, brooches, dress pins, and other trinkets. These items, together with waste products, suggest that a workshop operated on the site for at least 2 generations, although no iron smithing hearth has been found. Among the tools left behind were a small anvil, as well as a complete set of iron clippers or shears. Over 200 knives were also found. Several have survived with their handles intact, still attached to the knife. The handles are of horn, bone, and wood, and sometimes the blades themselves are decorated, for example, with inlaid copper wire. As well as making the knife more attractive, this is a technique that might have been used to create a mark of the maker. Of course, we also have evidence for woodworking. Alder and field maple provided the majority of the raw material for the standard tableware of the Viking period. Numerous wooden bowls for preparing and serving food were found in the dig, as well as cups that had been given a painted decoration. In fact, the name Coppergate is thought to be derived from a term meaning street of the cup makers, and the many wooden cores discarded on site would seem to support this interpretation. With regard to weaponry, a few pieces were found, but among them a broad-bladed iron axe head. The wooden handle is missing, but might have been up to 1 meter in length. Axes of this kind are represented on the biotapestry, for example, where they are shown in the hands of men cutting down trees. Finds of woodworking included several probable bits from augers. They vary in size and would have produced holes ranging in diameter from 9 to 35 millimeters. There is also one sort of mysterious item, a curved piece of antler, that has been interpreted as a handle from a bow saw. Historical leather is a rare survivor in archaeology, making the goods found at Coppergate very, very important. Large quantities of leather offcuts from Coppergate show that leather workers must have operated in the area. Over 1,700 shoes of a Viking Age and later date were recovered, including 5 Viking-era examples formed from a single piece of leather. One of these, a nearly complete shoe for a left foot, was cut to size with a central sole and an upper on either side. The uppers were then folded up and around the foot and sewn together. A drawstring tied at the front fastened the shoe to its wearer. The majority of shoes from the Viking levels are of turned shoe construction, made with separate uppers and sole. The name refers to the fact that shoes of this kind are molded and stitched inside out on a wooden last. We also have evidence for the use of iron awls, the small sharp tools commonly associated with shoemaking. But shoes were not the only products. We also have purses, pouches, and sheaths, and most of them were of calf skin. That was the preferred material for producing these goods, probably because the skin is both thinner and more malleable. The tools used for decorating fine leather goods, known as creasers, were also found at Coppergate. We know that the Viking world abounds in silver Arabic coins, in dirhams. We know it was a bullion economy, meaning that the silver was valued according to its weight and purity, and we also know that the Vikings came in contact with coinage from Western Europe. But in Coppergate, not long after the Viking settlement, the rulers began to issue coinage of their own as well. Although silver was still valued according to weight, the coins had a special cultural significance, sometimes also associated with the adoption of Christianity. 2 iron coin dies were recovered from the floors, and the examples are for the obverse side of 2 different coins. Both have been damaged, but we could identify the earlier of the 2. It was producing a coin of the St. Peter's penny type. These coins were struck in York, and they featured a cross, but also an inverted hammer, which may or may not have been a reference to Thor. And the other die is slightly later. It is in the name of King Athelstan, proclaiming him king of all Britain. York was a cultural melting pot. The Vikings brought with them from the Scandinavian homelands motifs and styles of ornamentation, sometimes reflecting Norse mythology. For example, the carving at St. Helens in Skipwith in Yorkshire. It has human figures in helmets and a large wolf-like beast that can be associated perhaps with Fenrir. But the conversion to Christianity seems to have taken place quite rapidly, within a generation or so. The Viking-era cemetery excavated below the minster's south transept has provided evidence for a range of burial rites, sometimes looking more Christian, sometimes looking more pre-Christian. They would have been very mixed at any rate. At least 2 of the Viking rulers, Guthfrith and Sweyn Forkbeard, are supposed to have been buried in York Minster. However, the minster itself seems to have been in decline for much of the Viking period, and in fact churches remained quite vulnerable throughout this period. On the other hand, the number of Viking-era stone carvings found at churches across York does suggest that several were established in the same time, at points to an adoption at least by the ruling classes. A letter of King Canute, son of Sweyn Forkbeard, reassures the English subjects that he would put a stop to the Viking raids and he will exalt God's praise everywhere. So indeed, a wind of change.
The last Viking king of York is Eric Bloodaxe, who died in 954 in the Battle of Stainmore, and his court was described as a bit of an anachronism. It was very pagan, at least according to contemporary sources. Anyway, afterwards, the Kingdom of York was absorbed into the unified Kingdom of England. However, the region did retain a Scandinavian character many years afterwards. One episode also involves Harald Hardrada, who briefly invaded the city after the Battle of Fulford, and York also put up resistance against the Norman conquest, and it eventually succumbed to the so-called harrying of the north.
Please don't forget about the Viking turd. There is already a short video on the channel waiting for a click. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching or listening, and I do hope this was interesting and insightful. If so, please consider a paid membership because it would greatly help this history project I am running as a freelancer. You can also contribute with a small donation. Thanks again. This was Irina. Take care, and till next time.